Tonight, the latest developments demand your full attention. And once you hear this, you'll understand why. I'm speaking to you at a moment when silence inside the palace is louder than any official statement, when carefully rehearsed reassurances are no longer enough to contain what's unfolding behind closed doors. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't speculation and it isn't theatre. It's the kind of information that changes tone inside rooms where decisions are made quietly, urgently, and without public consent. Just days ago, members of the Royal Medical Circle were summoned under conditions that immediately raised concern. Not routine check-ins, not symbolic consultations. This was an escalation. Specialists who are rarely called together were brought in, not to confirm recovery, but to reassess trajectory. That distinction matters more than the palace wants you to realise. According to sources with direct access to these discussions, Catherine's condition prompted a shift from short-term monitoring to long-term management considerations. Language inside those briefings grew careful, clinical, and deliberately restrained. Words were chosen not for comfort, but for accuracy. And when accuracy replaces optimism, it signals something serious. What's striking is not panic, is precision. Medical professionals reportedly emphasize stability, control, and risk reduction. Not urgency in the dramatic sense, but urgency in restraint. The kind that tells you progress is possible, but fragile. That pushing forward too quickly could reverse gains that took weeks to secure. Inside the palace, this created immediate tension. Public schedules had already been softened, but now they were quietly dismantled. Engagements vanished from calendars without explanation. Appearances were postponed indefinitely, not rescheduled. Staff were instructed to redirect inquiries without offering timelines. Even trusted aides were given limited information, a move that alone signaled how tightly the situation was being managed. Catherine herself, according to those closest to her, was fully informed. There was no attempt to shield her from medical realities. She asked detailed questions, requested clarity, and showed a level of composure that both impressed and unsettled those in the room. This wasn't denial, this was awareness, and awareness changes everything. One senior source described a moment during a briefing when the conversation paused, not because there were no answers, but because the answers carried weight. The discussion wasn't about when she would return to public life, but whether returning too soon would compromise long-term outcomes. That's not a cosmetic concern. That's a fundamental shift in priority. The palace, however, exists on visibility. For an institution built on presence, absence is destabilizing. Catherine is not just another member of the family. She is continuity embodied, reliability, a figure the public trusts instinctively. And when that figure disappears without explanation, reassurance becomes difficult to maintain. Internally, advisors reportedly debated disclosure strategies. How much truth could be shared without triggering speculation? Whether gradual updates would calm concern or inflame it, and whether acknowledging uncertainty would undermine confidence more than silence. The decision they reached was cautious to the point of opacity. Public messaging focused on positivity, strength, and privacy. Internally, the language was different, controlled, conditional, focused on management rather than milestones. That gap between what was said publicly and what was discussed privately is where this story truly begins, because information does not remain contained forever. The first indications of a leak didn't come from journalists. They came from professional circles, discreet conversations, quiet confirmations, medical terminology shared without context, but with concern. Enough to suggest that what was unfolding was not routine. Once those details reached individuals who understood their significance, the palace realized containment was slipping. And still, silence held, no corrections, no clarifications, no updated statements, just the continuation of absence. Catherine's withdrawal from public view became complete. No controlled photographs, no brief appearances, not even symbolic gestures. Those who know her well say this was not a decision made lightly. She understands the role she plays. She understands expectation, but she also understands limits. And for the first time, those limits were non-negotiable. One person familiar with the situation described her mindset as focused, inward, and protective, not just of herself, but of her future capacity. There is an understanding that recovery is not linear, that progress can stall or reverse under pressure, and pressure in this context is constant. What complicates matters further is the emotional toll of enforced stillness. Catherine has long been defined by action, engagement, and outward calm. Being sidelined, even temporarily, is not simply a logistical challenge. It's an identity disruption. Those close to her say she has moments of frustration, not because of the condition itself, but because of the narrative vacuum surrounding it. She is aware that silence breeds speculation. She knows that absence invites interpretation. And yet the medical advice remains firm: reduce exposure, reduce stress, reduce unpredictability. Those three directives clash directly with royal life, which brings us to the leak that changed everything. The information that surfaced was not dramatic. It wasn't framed for impact. That's precisely why it carried credibility. It described extended oversight, ongoing evaluation, conditional progress, no deadlines, no guarantees. Once those details began circulating, palace leadership faced a dilemma: address it and risk revealing uncertainty, or ignore it and hope it dissipated. They chose the latter. But ignoring information doesn't erase it. It transforms it. Concern turned into suspicion, silence into perceived concealment. And the longer Catherine remained unseen, the louder the questions became. Why had no clear update been offered? Why were appearances removed entirely rather than scaled back? Why was there no reassurance grounded in specifics? Inside the palace, some advisors reportedly pushed for a controlled acknowledgement, a statement that framed the situation honestly without alarm. But others argued that admitting uncertainty would open the door to relentless scrutiny. In the end, inertia won, and inertia has consequences, because while the institution waited, the public filled the gap themselves. Theory spread, concern intensified, trust began to wobble, not because people feared the worst, but because they sensed something wasn't being shared. Catherine's role in all of this remains critical. She has not demanded secrecy. She has not pushed for dramatization. She has simply followed medical guidance and accepted the cost of doing so. That cost, however, is growing. The longer the silence continues, the harder it becomes to recalibrate expectations. A sudden return would raise questions. A prolonged absence already has. The window for simple reassurance is narrowing. And inside the palace, this is understood. There are reports of internal reassessments, not of her condition, but of communication strategy, of whether continued opacity serves anyone, of whether trust can be preserved without context. What's clear is that this situation has forced uncomfortable conversations about vulnerability, about transparency, about whether the monarchy can acknowledge human fragility without appearing diminished. Catherine, at the center of it all, remains largely removed from these debates. Her focus, according to those closest to her, is singular: stabilize, recover, preserve capacity. Everything else is secondary, and yet everything else is pressing in, because symbols matter, and when a symbol disappears, people search for meaning. As this story continues to unfold, the question is no longer whether Catherine will return to public life, but how and under what conditions. Whether the institution will adapt to medical reality or continue to resist it. And whether silence, once protective, has now become the greatest risk of all. Before I continue with what's emerging next and the internal pressures building behind palace walls, make sure you're subscribed and let me know in the comments. Do you believe the palace is protecting Catherine or protecting itself? And as the palace continued to hold its breath, the pressure behind the scenes intensified in ways the public never saw. Because once silence stretches too long, it stops being neutral. It becomes a decision. And that decision began to fracture relationships inside the institution itself. Senior aides, according to multiple sources, found themselves divided not by loyalty, but by fear. Fear of saying too much, fear of saying too little, fear of being the one remembered as having mishandled a moment that history would later judge harshly. Meetings grew longer, not because solutions were found, but because no one wanted to be the voice that set precedent. Every scenario was discussed: a controlled update, a partial appearance, a written message attributed directly to Catherine. Each option carried risk. Too visible, and concerns about her health would spike. Too vague, and accusations of concealment would grow louder. And hovering over all of it was one unspoken truth. Once the public sees her again, every detail will be analyzed. Her posture, her weight, her expression, her energy, nothing will go unnoticed. Nothing will be forgiven if it appears inconsistent with earlier assurances. That level of scrutiny is not theoretical. It is expected, and the medical team, aware of this, reportedly reinforced their guidance. Recovery is not performance. Healing does not respond well to observation. Stress, even emotional stress, can alter outcomes. So Catherine remained out of sight. Those closest to her described days that are carefully structured, medical routines, rest periods, limited interaction, moments of normalcy deliberately preserved to maintain morale. There is no drama in these descriptions, no sense of crisis, but there is discipline, and discipline only emerges when stakes are high. At the same time, the palace began preparing contingencies, quiet ones, adjustments to future planning, subtle redistributions of responsibilities, not announcements, preparations, because institutions like this do not wait passively. They plan for absence even while hoping for presence. This is where the prognosis becomes more than medical. It becomes institutional. Catherine's long-term visibility is now a variable, not an assumption, and variables require flexibility. The monarchy, however, is not built for flexibility. It is built for continuity. That tension has begun to show. Sources say internal discussions now include phrases like phased reintroduction and symbolic engagement. These are not terms used when someone is expected to resume full duties quickly. They are used when endurance, not immediacy, is the priority. What makes this moment particularly sensitive is Catherine's public image. She has never been associated with volatility or unpredictability. Her consistency has been her strength, and that makes any deviation from expectation more jarring, which is why the silence has become so loud. Outside the palace walls, concern has shifted tone. It's no longer idle curiosity, it's protective. People aren't demanding spectacle, they're asking for honesty, reassurance grounded in reality, not optimism. Inside, that shift has been noticed. There are reports that Catherine herself has expressed discomfort with how opaque things have become. Not because she wants exposure, but because she understands trust. And trust, once questioned, is difficult to rebuild. Still, she has not overridden medical advice, and that restraint speaks volumes. This is not someone being controlled. This is someone choosing caution. And that distinction matters. As days stretch into weeks, the institution faces a narrowing window. At some point, absence requires explanation. At some point, reassurance requires substance. The palace cannot rely indefinitely on goodwill built over years. What happens next will define more than a health narrative. It will define how the monarchy handles vulnerability in a modern world. Will they acknowledge uncertainty? Will they recalibrate expectations? Or will they continue to hope that silence holds? One insider described the current strategy as managed waiting, not denial, not disclosure, just waiting for stability, for clarity, for an opportunity to speak without risk. But waiting has consequences too, because every day Catherine remains unseen. The story grows without her voice, and stories told without their central figure rarely end gently. There is no indication that her condition has worsened suddenly. That rumor is unfounded, but there is equally no indication that resolution is imminent. That hope is premature. What exists instead is a plateau, and plateaus are uncomfortable because they offer no clear direction. For Catherine, the priority remains health. For the palace, the priority remains perception. And until those priorities align, tension will persist. As I'm speaking to you now, discussions are ongoing. Scenarios are being modeled. Advisors are weighing words with extraordinary care, because once spoken, they cannot be unsaid. One misstep could undermine years of trust. And that's the weight bearing down on this moment. I want to be clear about something. This is not a story of collapse. It is not a story of crisis spiraling out of control. It is a story of restraint and the difficulty institutions face when restraint conflicts with expectation. Catherine is being protected medically. Whether she is being protected narratively is another question entirely, and that question remains unanswered. As more information inevitably surfaces, context will matter, compassion will matter, and patience will matter more than speculation ever could. So I'll ask you again, because this conversation doesn't end here. Do you believe the palace should speak openly, even if the truth is uncertain? Or is silence still the most responsible choice? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you might think. If you want to stay informed as this story continues to develop without hysteria, without denial, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because when silence finally breaks, understanding will matter more than reaction. Thank you for listening. We'll be watching closely.